We are going to start as a sitting as the Board of Health, so we need a motion.
Second.
Motion and second says Board of Health. All those in favor? Aye. Mr. Singer.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. Just a quick request for an exception to the County Water and Sewer Master Plan. Mr. and Mrs. Grundy own a property at 805 Old Liberty Road in the Eldersburg area, and their house is presently on an existing septic system. There was not too long ago, there was a subdivision built behind their house. The sewer line was run and whatnot. So they're in the existing sewer service area. They can access the sewer line, however, the cost is very high, and they're asking for an exception to be able to, for the health department to be able to evaluate, potentially issue an on-site septic permit to be able to install a septic system in the existing sewer service area. They have preliminary estimates that the cost of connecting the public sewer, because they have to construct a main between two lots in the new subdivision, would be in the neighborhood of $60,000. The estimated cost of an on-site sewage disposal system would be somewhere between $10,000 and $20,000. And they're asking for this exception because they feel this creates an undue hardship on them. The house is on the market, and as a condition of the purchaser purchasing the property, they want the septic system replaced or connected to public sewer. We've consulted with the planning department and the department of your utilities department, and they both support this request for an exception, and the health department is recommending an exception in accordance with there was a Health Board Resolution 5 that essentially requires us to come to the Board of Health anytime somebody wants to install an on-site septic system in an area that's served by public sewer and wants this type of exception. So at this point, I'm requesting that the Board of Health approve the exception for the evaluation and installation of an on-site sewage disposal system at 805 Old Liberty Road in Eldersburg. I will add this caveat that the perks will have to pass. It is a relatively small lot, and they're going to have to be able to fit a system in there. It's possible that they might not be able to get a septic system in there, and they may have to connect to public sewer anyway, but this allows them to move forward with evaluating for an on-site septic system and potentially installing it there if you were to approve a motion.
So you're going to evaluate the lot to make sure a septic system can go there and it'd be okay for the houses around and so forth?
Yes.
Okay.
So I spoke with Ms. Grundy, is that it, for half an hour yesterday about this. Have any of you spoken with her? So she is in a pickle here, and I appreciate you bringing this to the Board of Commissioners so we can work out something. Just to be clear, we're not going to take her out of the water and sewer plan. We're going to leave her in the plan, but grant her an exception to go septic, assuming that she can get it. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. And also, just to be clear, one of the things that I discussed with her yesterday was the fact that we've had record rainfall, 300% of what we normally expect. It's once in a century kind of rainfall, and the septic company that did the inspection of her existing on-site disposal system, really, I don't know that they actually said that it failed as much as they said the flow was slow. That's not surprising, considering our ground is heavily saturated in Carroll and much of the mid-Atlantic and southeast United States right now. And my recommendation to her was to run another flow test once the ground dries out a little bit, because these were exceptional circumstances under which to do any kind of absorption analysis or anything that would affect the flow rate. So I do support giving her this exception, but I also want to point out that I'm not even certain she needs a new septic system. She might very well pass once the ground dries out and returns to what I'm just going to label as normal, more normal conditions, because we're under exceptional circumstances right now. But I do support this exception for her.
If I could just add, Roberta and I had a conversation yesterday about this, and that is the health department does not have any regulatory authority on property transfers. We don't consider the septic system to be failing. It's between the owner and the buyer, and often the bank. and a private inspection of the septic system. So it's not that we're requiring the septic system to be replaced, but as a condition, I guess the person who's purchasing the property is essentially requiring it because they're not satisfied with the inspection report.
But the fact is that...
I agree with that clarification.
Yeah, but they also could not replace it without the exception, right?
Right.
They'd have to go to
They
public
cannot-
water and sewer.
There are two pieces of this. There's a law that in the environment article that talks about exceptions to the master plan, and I have the authority to grant exceptions to that as the designee of the Secretary of the Environment when it comes to granting exceptions to the master plan. There's also Health Board Resolution number 5 that was passed by the county that essentially requires that the health department not issue any permits in the service area unless we get the approval of the Board of Health.
Okay, and just so I understand the mechanics, are we approving this subject to the determination that a septic system would work there, or are we passing it and that just gives her the option to explore all options?
And that, I think we're just asking you for an exception to allow her to pursue a septic permit on this lot. We're not going to issue her a permit if the soils aren't suitable or it's not suitable for the installation of an on-site septic system. She would have to go back to the option of connecting to public sewer. And honestly, public sewage is always the best alternative as far as we're concerned.
Right.
However, we do realize that it is a significant hardship considering the cost to her is going to be, you know, if this was going to cost her $25,000 or $30,000 and that was relatively the same as it would cost for any other sewer connection in the county, we would not be supporting this because there's a certain economics that go into you all running a water and a wastewater system, and you need people to connect. Right. In this case, it's unusual because she has to run more of a sewer main between a couple of properties that are on a subdivision, and it drives the cost up to about $60,000 for her. And I think that that's a reasonable request for a hardship, and that's why we're here with this request for you today.
They have to do a perk test first,
Yes,
then they can move ahead with the drain field.
correct.
Mr. President, I make the motion that we approve the exception for the sewer system.
I'll second that.
We have a motion and a second. Any further discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ed.
Mr. President, I make a motion that we adjourn as the Board of Health and return to the Board of Commissioners.
Yeah, second.
We have a motion and a second. All those in favor? Aye. All right, now we're back as the Board of Commissioners. Our next thing is site distance. I would say we have a number of county staff here, I don't know, 10 or whatever it is. They're all here to weigh in on this if you feel, if you feel the need. And I guess as Commissioner Rothschild, you're starting with this one?
I guess. I'm rushing to put something together here, Mr. President.
Sure.
Okay. Okay. So let's start at the beginning here.
It's a good place to start.
The current line of sight ordinance is only 3 sentences. I'm just going to paraphrase it. It says a property owner shall not maintain any fence, wall, mailbox, trees, etc., which causes an obstruction to vision for motorists entering the highway. You shouldn't maintain or erect anything that causes an obstruction. So far, so good, on the surface at least. Second sentence. The zoning administrator, no, that's not the second sentence. Yeah, the second sentence. The zoning administrator shall determine in conjunction with the Carroll County Bureau of Roads Operation whether an object constitutes an obstruction. That's the second sentence. I've just gone through what's in the current ordinance. And then there's a third sentence in the current ordinance. Everything else is a change. And the third sentence, it's not showing up on here because I'm using different software. And then the third sentence says, where is it?
Commissioner, I can read it for you if you'd like.
Yeah, one of us can read, Commissioner, we have
The
it.
third sentence says, Section B of that section of the code states, for any fence, wall, mailbox, hedge, tree, shrubbery, vines, weeds, plantings, etc., which is determined to be an obstruction to vision. This section shall supersede section 158.033,
Exactly.
which is our section that covers non-conforming uses.
And pre-existing conditions.
Well, no, not pre-existing, it covers non-conforming uses,
158.033 covers
non-conforming uses.
existing non-conforming uses.
Yes.
Right. So if I have a retaining wall, right now, if I have a retaining wall on my property, let me look, I got
What that section of the code basically says, Commissioner, is that if there's been a retaining wall there that was put in place in 1940,
Yep,
it's in our non-conforming use section, it says it can remain there. But this sentence here says that it has to comply with this section.
it would
has to be
supersede
removed.
it. This would supersede. So if I had a
Yes.
retaining wall that's been there for 100 years, and my neighbor says, nope, it's an obstruction, I can't see from 15 feet back, that language, which says this supersedes 158.033, in this text of this ordinance as it's currently written would supersede that, the rights to keep the pre-existing structure. Am I right, Tim?
That's the way it's written, yes.
That's the right.
Well, not if your neighbor says so. It doesn't, the neighbor's not in the code.
Okay.
So
Fair enough.
no, it's not that way.
Okay, so let's talk about what we do when a complaint comes. If the neighbor complains, it says, and I'm just going to use this example because it's one that we're talking about, a 100-year retaining wall. So what happens? The neighbor says, I can't see when I'm sitting 15 feet back, so they file a complaint. It says it's causing obstruction. So the zoning administrator is deployed, right? The next step is the zoning administrator is deployed, right, Jay? And you're sent out along with the Carroll County Bureau of Roads. Okay, and you look at the intersection.
Initially, Commissioner, once we receive the complaint, we open an investigation, and we will just send our inspector out first
Okay.
by herself
Okay,
and have her take a look at it. And if she feels that, yes, it could possibly be a problem,
okay,
then we contact the roads department, ask for them to come out to check the site distance
okay,
and make a determination if there's an obstruction or not.
okay. So tell us what Roads does when they arrive. So Roads is deployed, they come out and they're told, we got a complaint, there's an obstruction, 100-year retaining wall. What does Roads do when they arrive?
You need, that'd be up to roads.
Yes. We
Go ahead.
we follow the ASTRO specification, and
No acronyms. Tell us what that means.
there we go. Oh, great, smaller writing.
American Association of State
State
Highways.
Highways.
State highways.
Yeah.
Look up the standard road specifications. That's
how we start every
You go to a standards manual, okay, you go to a standards manual, and what do you do next?
We sit back, and there's a measurement taken from 15 feet back from the stop line. 15 feet back, looked in either direction, and it depends, and a determination is made of what the distance of sight distance that we have at that point.
Okay.
So if somebody erects something,
Okay.
we look at it, if that is in the way.
Okay, but it's a
if there's
100-year-old road. It's
But it
100
depends, it's
retaining
determined
wall.
on speed of the roadway, so we look at what our sight distance total is. Then, looking at the roadway, the speed of the roadway, we look at the charts and the angles, and it says, okay, at this speed of this roadway, from 15 feet back, there is a determination saying, yes, this is clear.
Okay, so let's be more specific. You go out, and you go back 15 feet from the fog line, 4 feet high,
3.5
and you
feet.
look down the road, and if somebody says, the neighbor on my right, to the right, on the right side of the intersection, as I'm pulling out, has a retaining wall, just using that as an example, and if it's a 40-mile-an-hour road, the line of sight would be approximately, what we require, about 450 feet, Chris, is that right?
No, more than that for 450, or 40 miles an hour, be 550 feet.
550 feet,
But it's
so we said-
measured at 3.5 feet high.
So it'd be 550 feet, an objective number, 550 feet, right? Objective number out of standards book, and you'll measure it from 15 feet back, an objective measurement number, right? From where the driver would be in the car, and you look, and if you can't see 550 feet back, you can only see 400 feet back, you got a violation, right?
It is non-conforming
You got a
based
violation.
off the federal standard,
You got a violation. Now what happens?
the national standard.
Now what happens? You've determined that the line of sight is 30% less than what it should be. What happens next?
Hold on. Now it can be referred back to Jay if I'm not
That's correct. We get a report from the roads department operation stating that there's an obstruction, and then we will contact the property owner, which we've already contacted the property owner when we first go out there. But we'll contact the property owner, meet with them, discuss with them, tell them what the problem is and what needs to be done to correct it.
And the property owner says, I don't want to knock down my 100-year-old retaining wall. What happens next?
We will give them time to make their decision whether they want to do it or not. If they don't do it within 30 days, we'll send them a notice of violation stating that they're in violation of the code, and they have 30 days to either remove the obstruction and clear it, or they can appeal the decision, my decision, that there's a violation to the Board of Zoning
Appeal
Appeals.
it to who?
Board of Zoning
The
Appeals.
BZA. Okay,
My
so the
decisions are to
so
the
the
Board of Zoning
BZA
Appeals.
gets it. The BZA now gets it. I'm just going through the process for the commissioners, okay? The BZA now gets it, and they're told they're going to have a hearing to determine whether or not Jane Doe should remove her 100-year-old retaining wall. And Jane Doe's position, by the way, is that the only reason her neighbor's complaining against her is because he doesn't like her because of a prior dispute, okay? And the BZA looks at the code, they look at the existing code, which basically says, the only thing it says is the zoning administrator shall determine in conjunction with the Carroll County Bureau of Operations, determine whether an object is an obstruction. So you walk up in front of this BZA says to you, Chris, Jeff, is this an obstruction? What do you say to them? When the BZA asks you that question, what do you say?
Doesn't meet current site distance.
Doesn't meet current site distance. In other words, it's an obstruction. Okay? Now, show me in the code what discretionary authority the BZA has under this text as it's currently written. Now, I'm on the BZA. Tell me what discretionary. You're the county attorney. Tim, you're the county attorney. Advise me. I'm a BZA member. What discretionary authority do I have to waive that on the BZA under this text as it's currently written based on paragraph B? I've already had roads and public works that said, yep, it's an obstruction. What authority do I have now to issue a variance?
Well, the standard the BZA is going to have is deciding whether or not the zoning administrator made an error when he or she concluded that it constituted an obstruction of vision. So
No error. There's no error. There's no question that retaining walls cut the vision from 550 down to 400 feet. It's been like that for 100 years, but it's there. What discretionary authority do I have as a BZA member now?
if you conclude he made no error, you don't really
I have no discretionary authority. If it really exists, if it's been there for 100 years and the vision is 400 feet, not 550, there is an obstruction, there's no error made, I have no discretionary authority as a member of the BZA, rip down your pre-existing 100-year-old retaining wall. That's the only decision that can come out of the BZA, unless they choose to give themselves powers which are not currently in the law as it's written, right?
Unless they decide it's not an obstruction of visit, that he did err, that he made a mistake.
But he did it according to national traffic standards. He measured it 3.5 feet off the ground, 15 feet back. So, no mistake there. Here it is, Mr. BZA member. This is what the instructions are for taking the measurement. I got the book. And since I got the book and I'm doing it by the standards, no mistake has been made, I can prove that his 100-year-old retaining wall is blocking, is an obstruction under the standards, and I, as a BZA member, have no discretionary authority, given that I've determined it is not a mistake, it is an obstruction, it's not a mistake other than say rip it down.
Okay.
That kind of situation exists all over the country. I can start showing you pictures of where these kinds of situations exist.
Sounds like
The
that's
law
all right.
needs to have discretionary adjustment authority in there for the BZA and the zoning administrator. They need discretionary authorities under this law, so they're not forced into doing unnatural things based on standards that somebody wrote and failed to anticipate extenuating
So what
circumstances.
standard would they use?
Well, here are some of the here are some of the recommendations. I've had discussions with a few people, including staff. Number one, I wanted to prepare a picture of this. I didn't have it. Let's assume that, let's go with the fact that right now they do the measurement 15 feet back from the fog line. And the retaining wall
Where's
is
it
on,
taken from the stop line, right?
from the fog line.
From the edge of the travel lane.
Okay.
The fog
Go
line,
ahead.
the fog line.
And it depends on the kind of road and the intersection you're talking about too. So there are different standards depending on.
I can't go through all of them, but
Correct.
these are the
Just so
answers
you
staff
know.
has given me.
It's not all.
Have you gentlemen not used the term 15 feet back from the fog line? Is that not the term you've used in explaining this to me? 15 feet back from the fog line?
We use edge of roadway, but
Well, the
yes.
fog line is at the edge of the roadway.
Well, you asked him what word he uses a different word. Let him answer his own question.
Okay, but the fog line is at the edge of the roadway, and I'm using their vernacular, Doug, that's why I am being emphatic about this. Okay, so let's assume that while this retaining wall is on the right at 15 feet, on the left side of the intersection where there's no complaint, there happens to be a barn or a building. And in fact, to see up on the left side of the road, you'd have to pull up within about 10 feet of the roadway. Well, I had a discussion with John, what's our state guy's name? Starts with a C. Concanon this morning. I said, well, a reasonable woman or a reasonable man would never stop at 15 feet back because they got a barn on one side. They would move up to 10 feet and they would look. But voila, at 10 feet, the line of sight goes back to 550 feet. This ordinance, as it currently exists, does not give our staff the discretionary authority to say, you know what, based on extenuating circumstances and pre-existing conditions at this intersection, we're going to measure that from 10 feet back rather than 15 feet back, because nobody would stop 15 feet back because you'd never be able to see anyway on one side because of barns on the other side of the road, or a berm, or a hill,
Commissioner.
or a 200-year-old oak tree.
The only thing, this ordinance here that we have right now would not apply to that barn, because that's an existing structure, and it's not exempted in the ordinance.
I'll use a different example
So-
then, Jay. You want me to use a different
No,
example?
I'm just-
There's a
just wanna
berm
let
on a
you know
piece
that-
of land that the county owns. Okay, if I sound aggravated over this, and I'm trying to give you gentlemen and ladies more discretionary authority, because you have none under this. In fact, I want to point out, when I challenged all of you over this in my office, you said you had no discretionary
I don't.
authority. And then later on in that discussion, you said, no, we actually give it a 20% discretionary authority. I
No,
said, well,
sir,
you
I
have
did not
that
say
right.
that.
We've given that to ourselves. It's county policy. you
No,
told me.
sir, I never said that.
Commissioner Rochester, I think we need to bring the tone down to something a little, they're not on trial here. We're just trying to get policy established.
Thank you, Doug.
See some of those pictures.
So, the point I want to make is this. The point I want to make.
I'll leave 5 minutes.
I only had.
Abstain.
The point I want to make is this. We could be going after somebody on the right side of the road, on the passenger side, because they got obstruction at 15 feet, but on the left side, there could be a county berm that we own that's 10 feet, that goes back to 10. Nobody would stop 15 feet back. They'd pull up to 10 feet before trying to pull out of the intersection. There are probably hundreds of intersections in this county right now. I drove this morning for 15 minutes and took a half a dozen pictures at random. And they weren't necessarily the best specimens, but I'm trying to give you some idea what some of these situations might look like.
So, Commissioner, what issue are we trying to address? What's the problem?
The issue we're trying to address, Commissioner Howard, is very simple. I think that this ordinance is potentially being weaponized by neighbor against neighbor in at least one, maybe two cases right now. And I'm trying to put in some discretionary criteria that staff could consider in deciding whether or not to grant relief, such as the
Wait
number of
a second,
complaints.
since you said the neighbor against neighbor, that's why the neighbor can make the complaint, but then people from county go down and look at it. And from what you said, there's actually 3 checks, 3 different people that go down to make sure it's right. Now, whether it's, that's why it's not it's not the neighbors, well, I think this is obstructing me. No, we go by national standards, and it gets checked 3 times. I mean, you're making it seem like if
You're
Commissioner
confusing.
Wentz and I have a disagreement, and I don't like a fence or something he's erected, I'm gonna say, whoa, I can't see out of there, and then someone comes up and tears his fence down because it's obstructing my view. No, because you've got people from the county to come out and check it to make sure it meets the national standards.
Commissioner Frazier, you seem to be somehow missing a very simple fact.
Go ahead.
Cross-checking each other for whether an objective standard is being made is different than giving staff discretionary authority to deviate. They have
I
no
didn't miss that.
discretionary authority to deviate right now.
I
But these
understand.
amendments that I am proposing would potentially provide a number of extenuating or other considerations that could be considered by the zoning administrator whether to grant relief. The number of complaints received regarding the obstruction, the relevant number of historical traffic accident data with respect to the alleged obstruction, the degree of the visibility impairment. Is it 1% or is it a 50% impairment? The volume of traffic at the subject property. Is it 100 cars per hour or is it 1 car per hour? The length of time the object's been in place. Has it been in place for 1 month because they just put up a fence that's blocking the view? Or has the retaining wall been in place for 100 years? Possible alternatives such as measuring the line of sight from maybe 10 feet back rather than 15 feet back. And let me just jump to the end. And then at the very end of this, what are the remedies we're proposing? Well, specifically with respect to county staff, the zoning administrator may grant a variance of up to 50% from the standard 15-foot setback when measuring the line of sight, and a 25% variance for the total line of sight. And then if it has to go to the Board of Zoning Appeals, they would have power to offer a variance, grant a variance of up to 50% based on the extenuating circumstances that are now would be put into the text amendment, such as number of complaints, number of accidents, degree of impairment, and this would give objective levels of flexibility to both the zoning administrator and the BZA in trying to arbitrate and deal with these conflicts between neighbors. We don't have that flexibility today, and any flexibility we give ourselves is strictly outside of the ordinance.
If I could speak,
Sure.
and with all due respect, the first thing I want to indicate is that in this instance, when we're talking about an issue of safety, the Office of Zoning Administrator does not grant discretion and certainly does not have the expertise on any of these items to implement discretion. We're not experts in traffic accidents. We're not experts on the degree of visibility and the impairments and all. So a lot of those things are just not something that we could undertake as Zoning Administrator Office and make those determinations. And I think if we're going to use staff to make what I consider to be, using these criteria, somewhat arbitrary determinations, we are setting our staff up for failure in this instance. The second thing I'd like to bring up is, how is this code that we have right now being applied in actuality? We're talking about a lot of hypotheticals here, but in actuality, I'm looking at records that Mr. Boyd provided me, and since like 2007, roughly, so about 10 years, we've had about 52 cases of sight distance, complaint. Most of them actually are occurring more or less within the last 3 to 4 years. But I think, as I've indicated maybe to you all before, if I haven't, I'm going to tell you, the population is changing. People are wanting government to do more for them. So the demands on the zoning office are increasing. So this increase in the sight distance complaints is not, it's a reflection of overall complaints that we're getting across the board. All right. But, and Jay, please, chime in if you would, but what's happening, what we're seeing is that in most cases, when people are notified of this, they may say, I didn't realize it. What do I have to do to fix it? Or if they object to it, after it's explained to them, it's done quickly. So most of I would say that these sight distance cases, except for the 2 that are pending right now, are completed and done in a much more expeditious time frame than any other zoning case that you undertake. Would you agree with that, Mr. Boyd?
That's correct. Since it is a safety issue, we try to get it done as soon as we can.
And normally a 10-day letter goes out to folks and says you got 10 days to contact us, and our office addresses these immediately and lets people know they have to contact us immediately because of the safety issue. And most people will respond to that and implement that. So I'm very concerned with putting anything on staff that creates something other than a standard, because I think in this case, when we're talking safety, a standard is what we need to have to reinforce what we're doing. I will also say that, Jay, and you can correct me, but most of these ones that I've reviewed, they are more or less related to things that have just occurred. In other words, someone's put a sign up, or someone's trees have overgrown out, where maybe when they originally were planted, they were fine. Now things grow and the limbs are extended out and they're creating problems. Jay continually has neighbor versus neighbor. I think he will tell you that
the whole ordinance is basically a neighbor versus neighbor.
Exactly. So this is not
yes,
something
the whole ordinance
across the board. And so that's something that Jay and his staff deal with every day, multiple times a day. And and you all have been, I know, have been involved in some of those.
All right, so let me respond to your comments. Thank you for those comments, Tom. Number one, we don't expect...
Were you done? I'm fine, yes.
Well, number one, the zoning administrator does not make that go out alone. He brings roads in to make these determinations about what's reasonable. Number two, if as a government we're going to argue, and I've heard all of you argue this to me, that they have a right of appeal to the BZA or to the courts, then that suggests that our laws should provide some guidelines for what level of discretionary authority the BZA, the courts might have, and as it's currently written, it has 0, as Mr. Burke has already pointed out. And as a minimum, if you don't want that discretionary authority, Jay, fine. Okay, that's fine. We need to specify how much discretionary authority, though, the county and the BZA has, because that is not in the current ordinance. Nothing says the BZA has any discretionary authority with respect to this matter. If the standard is 500 feet and they only have 490 feet, based on the way the law is currently written, the BZA members would have no discretionary authority to grant relief unless they want to give themselves powers that are not in the current ordinance.
But it's a safety issue. It's a safety issue. That's the same way I have an old car. My car's brakes are supposed to stop, let's say, within 500 feet when I hit the brakes. I don't know but I'm just throwing it out there. But because my car is older and it's this and that, it'll stop in 550 feet. Can you allow me to do that to state inspection? Oh, sure, you can do that. But then the first time I try to stop and the 500 feet I'm past and I run into something, I was like, man, they passed my car and I just had an accident. How's that possible? It's the same thing here. It's a safety issue. It's not, let me finish. No, really, let me finish.
You don't know how to argue.
Let me finish. It's a safety issue. If we grant variances on this and something happens, then we're the ones that are liable for it. I don't think that's right.
So what is this?
There's a national standard, and it's a reason it's a national standard. They didn't just pull this out of the air.
So I've been told by staff that a homeowner's recourse, if they don't like the zoning administrator's decision, is to take it to the BZA. Okay, under our system of government, people are entitled to due process. I want to know what process they can have in a zoning ordinance which gives 0 discretionary authority to the BZA. I want to know what
process
discretion.
doesn't give someone the ability to change the law. I mean, I have discretion over whether the IRS rules correctly on my case. If I don't like that, I can go to tax court. It doesn't mean I change the tax code. I do know how to argue, no offense.
So other than
the law is those standards, right? Now, if the question is whether those are the right standards, that I think is something we could look at, although I don't know what we'd entertain as an
Well, Doug, that's a good question, because quite frankly, I would be so bold as to suggest that probably 10% of all the intersections in this county don't meet the current line of sight standards. Yet, when we go to enforce against them, it turns into a draconian exercise of legalism.
Well, besides these standards, the national safety standards, is there another set of standards out there for sightline?
No.
Well, then I guess these are the
Well,
ones
wait a
that
minute.
we'll be using.
When it's a Whiteside Road, we reduce the line of sight measurement to 10 feet. We
No.
drop to 10 feet for certain private roads or driveways, don't we?
For use in commons, which are white sign, no, they're
For
15
use in
feet.
common white signs, we measure it at 10 feet, not 15.
No, they're at 15.
Somebody told me
Multi-use
that we
driveway.
measure, when do we do 10? Use in common
Single-use driveway.
Single-use driveways, we do 10.
A driveway,
Single-use driveway.
right, not a road.
Does
Okay.
the state of Maryland adopt the same standards, or they?
Yes, we just were discussing that. They use the latest version of the AASHTO.
Right. The policy of geometric design and of highways and streets.
So, Tim, other than determining whether or not the roads made a factual mistake in the measurement, what discretionary authority does the BZA have if someone seeks remedy, seeks some discretionary assistance? What discretion do they have?
I guess the discretion would be, as Commissioner Howard said, all right, we don't agree with the roads, that's the proper standard. We think that it should be less because it's an existing structure. We shouldn't be applying, the BZA would have to go off and apply their own
Well,
standards.
they have to make it up. That's what this says. If it's in a pre-existing structure, the BZA can consider it. If there's no accidents, the BZA can consider it. If there's lots of accidents, the BZA can consider it. If the line of sight short is only 1% versus 50%, the BZA can consider it. Right now, it doesn't give them any of these authorities. They have to make it up. They'd have to ad-lib it and make it up and say, we're going to vary from the ordinance. Because isn't it true that most of our ordinances with regard to this actually specify what percentage of variance the BZA, how great their authorities are in terms of a percentage relief? Whether it's setbacks or something else, aren't these things usually specified in the law right now, Tim?
No, sir.
So, Commissioner Archon, I think part of the concern would be, though, let's say we gave a much wider array of discretion. Wouldn't that exacerbate how many claims we probably have from neighbors that now know that there's an objective standard that they can't? I mean, I could come out and wreak a lot more havoc, couldn't I? Because now I know I can make a case. You know what I mean? Right now, it's an objective standard.
Well, it'll be harder to make the case, Doug, because Right now, if
Depends on what they're-
if the
well,
line of
you-
sight requirement's 500 feet and you only got 499, you got a violation. Under
So-
this,
But if you're, are you gonna only give discretion in one direction?
yes, because the assumption is at 500 feet, that's the standard. The question is, under what conditions will we grant relief?
What if we had a condition that 15 feet was not far enough? I mean, I'm sure someone had to pick a number. It can't be perfectly ideal for every road.
No, I mean, you're talking a federal standard, and what they do is they look at the average of vehicles, and you sit back, and whether you're in a Chevy Suburban, a two-wheel drive pickup truck, a small vehicle, a small car, and you think about it too, is that, look at one of my plow trucks, or a delivery truck. You know, and you have a plow truck with the plow in the front of it, he's 15 feet back from the back of the road. He can move up to the stop line, but the plow might be in the center of the roadway. That might cause an issue.
Do all the jurisdictions use the same measures? Like state, other counties?
State highway uses the AASHTO standard,
Okay.
that's correct, yes.
But if we went to Baltimore County, Howard County, they would
Don't-
probably.
So, Commissioner, what are you asking for?
As a minimum, I would like to see this text, this ordinance amended to grant the zoning administrator and/or the BZA some amount of variance authority.
Okay, do you want to put that in the form of a motion?
Okay, I will. Instead of going with all the changes to this amendment, I will shorten it and suggest that we amend the current language to state that the zoning administrator may grant a variance of up to 50% from the standard 15-foot setback from fog line where the line of sight is customarily measured, and a 25% variance for total line of sight is measured from revised point of reference. And number two, the Board of Zoning Appeals may provide a 50% variance for total line of sight as measured from the revised point of reference. And we amend it by adding these two sentences to the existing
Should
ordinance.
take us back to 7.5 feet?
Well, let's see, we get a second, and then we can discuss.
7.5.
So we have a motion. Do we have a second on that motion? Motion dies for lack of a second. Do you have anything else?
Nope, nothing else.
All right, let's move on.
You win, the people of Carroll County lose.
Okay, we're looking for permit exemption for agricultural buildings up to 2,000 square feet. Mr. Weaver has got this one.
This basically starts,
1 second, so people can shift around.
shift around here.
I thought maybe they were going to weigh in on this.
Thanks.
Jeff, you can't leave. I'm just kidding.
Jeff, get ready.
I don't know if you can leave or not.
Oh, well. You could go.
From over here.
Okay, what I asked for is, you know, for agricultural buildings, apparently Baltimore County doesn't have any major restrictions on them. And we're looking at small agricultural structures, run-in buildings, lean-to, and some of them are constructed on structural lumber, those type things. We still have to do a site location for where the building is. It doesn't get in the line of sight for roads, but, you know, it has to be the proper setback on the property. But that we have some leeway here that, you know, there's no inspection and things on these small agricultural type structures that, you know, they're usually a run-in building for a horse or a couple head of cattle or something like that. Inspections on them are a little bit redundant sometimes, I think, you know, as far as that structure. So I wanted to try to get the consideration here, that we get a permit exemption for those small agricultural buildings, 1 story only, or 2-story buildings that fall into this category that, you know, constructed probably over a week or a weekend by the homeowner or something, just as a small type of structure. And, you know, I know, you know, won't be for any use for people, it cannot be used for any other venue. It's mostly for either livestock and or agricultural equipment storage. And it's less than 2,000 square feet.
What's our requirement now?
We currently require permits for all structures, including ag structures. So that's regardless of what size they are. So if we're doing a running shed or a stable or a pole building to store hay or farm equipment, a permit's required. We send it through the same process that we send other permits through to check for setbacks for zoning. We send it down to the zoning office for their approval. There are different setback requirements, whether you're using it as a storage building or versus a building to house animals. It also goes to the health department to ensure there's no interference with any particular on-site septic or well issues. And we also send it up to resource management to ensure that it's not being placed in any type of floodplain or anything like that.
Jason, at what point do those rules kick in? Is there a certain size, a certain type of structure?
No, they apply to all building permits.
Okay.
And speaking from an agricultural point of view here, a lot of times it's just a small structure that's out here in a windbreak more than anything for cattle, something like that, or, they store some hay bales in it or whatever. But it's not a major building we're talking about. We're looking at
So does someone get a permit for a shed?
Sheds over 150 square foot, you require a permit.
Okay.
Yeah.
So there is under a certain size, there is something different then?
Correct. Right. Yes, under 150 square foot, we do not require, unless there's permanent foundations. Again, when you get into permanent foundations, then it can have an effect on where it's located.
So, Commissioner Weaver, is the issue the cost, the time, or are we denying people?
Yes. Actually, okay. With the, onset of the on-site portable sawmills, guys saw these dead trees down or whatever, they saw their own lumber out, and many times, they plant the poles, put a structure up that, and cover it, at least a roof, maybe sides or 3 sides many times. It is time, it is a cost, our ag building's what, $100 fee for.
Correct.
I think, a permit. Yeah, they still have to come in, get the permit, but they're here, this is your plan, this is where it's gonna be. Okay, that's it.
So
It's
just to
not
make
gonna
sure
be in the
I
floodplain, it's not gonna be, you're gonna.
So you're still requiring to get a permit, you're just not, you're asking for the change to be that they don't have to be inspected.
Now,
Is that right?
actually, let me tell you how Frederick County handles this. I had a discussion with Frederick
I was
County.
confused by that.
Roberta, let me explain how Frederick County handles this. First of all, Baltimore County does not require permits for ag buildings. Frederick County has an exemption. You don't need a building permit. You don't need a building permit in Frederick County for any ag structure for ag purposes under 7,500 square feet. Now, doesn't mean you don't go into the county office building. You still go in and you get what they refer to as simply a zoning permit, which means they check the setbacks, they check to make sure it's not on top of a septic field, they check the position of the building, floodplain, they check it for the siting position, floodplain, septic, and setbacks from surrounding properties. But once you clear where the position is, you don't have to pull a building permit. Now, why is that important, Doug, going back to your question? Because ridiculous things are happening. Pulling building permits for things like run-in sheds, and we're ending up with huge roof joists, these things being over-designed because they have to be big enough to take a tractor in and hay and whatnot. And it's resulting in these things being over-designed and pushing the costs out through the roof, and yet these things would not happen in Frederick or Baltimore County. So we actually have a stricter building code for building an ag structure on ag land in Carroll County than we do in Baltimore and Frederick County. We are not competitive.
Is that because they have charter government?
So,
It's in spite of the charter.
Commissioners, in 2006, prior to 2006, we were applying just the application of a building permit, issuing it, and no inspections prior to 2006. In 2006, we realized that we had a lot of calls from farmers, 2003, 2002, when we had some large snowstorms. We were losing ag buildings. We were asked why. We found that pole buildings for ag was not to the current building code. They were reducing the roof load. With no inspections, we don't know how they're built. So we were actually losing buildings that farmers was paying good money, thinking they had a code-compliant building.
Well, it could be potentially dangerous.
Protecting your livestock, protecting your economy, whatever product you had, your machinery, employees during the winter in the snowstorms, because that's when you're working on that equipment. So we want to make sure that that building is safe for anybody who goes in there and the product.
But at that time, we had other large buildings fall too.
Yeah, we did, yes, absolutely.
Yeah, I get all that. My only question, I can see both sides of this, really. What happens if somebody's I mean, it could happen, it'd be kind of random, but there's a public safety individual operating in that building and it comes down, and that individual gets hurt, who's responsible? The landowner?
Is it a Tuesday or a
That's
Thursday?
a good question.
Well, yeah, well, it could be a Wednesday. But what happens, I mean, if there's no code in place or no procedure to get a permit, then that goes back to the landowner, right? Obviously.
I would assume.
So,
So they have to know that going into it, that could happen, and if somebody gets hurt, and it's built not with,
That could happen even if they get a permit. The government is not the guarantor and insurer
Okay.
of every building out there just because we issued a permit.
Well, I'm just looking at.
right, but
Yeah.
the building's put up to current standards if there's a permit pool.
right.
I'll also say that prior to this change in our Chapter 170, we also had an issue with folks calling their buildings agricultural buildings because they knew they could get away with a much lesser permit cost. They knew they could get away with no particular inspection process, and they would construct these buildings, and they were basically two, 3-car garages for their residential use.
Well,
So that was also another particular issue that we had.
And if you
When they
don't-
apply for the permit, make them produce, was it F, schedule tax return,
Schedule up, yeah.
Schedule F, yeah.
tax
Yeah.
form, to prove that they are.
Well, just because they have a farm, that doesn't mean it's an agricultural building.
Right.
That is correct.
That's
Jay,
why
did you have
if they're not
something?
operating, then they.
Just another way to look at it also from a zoning standpoint. We have a lot of people who come into our office and, "Hey, I want to put my this is where I want to put my building, and it meets the setbacks and everything. If they didn't get a permit and we didn't have a way of checking by going out and doing inspections, we would not know whether they're putting it in the right spot. They can move it anywhere on the property, and then they could be in violation. And once they get the building up, and if they're in violations, they have more trouble dealing with that than if they had gone through the permit process and we'd actually inspect it to ensure that it was where they said it was going to be.
Because then we gotta wait for some other neighbor to complain about that, right?
They complain about everything, Commissioner.
Yeah.
I'm only asking this for
Just
the
asking.
small buildings, this isn't
Well,
large.
is there another way, Jason, of the work that you're doing? I mean, is there anything, I mean, I know you've done a lot of work in your department to streamline processes and things like that. Is there anything along the way in this process that we could look at or should look at to say, well, actually, this is one of those things that really doesn't really relate to the structure or is it just, if we want to put up a safe building, it is what it is?
If you want to put up a safe building, it is what it is. Regarding run-in sheds and things like that, those smaller buildings, in my opinion, I still think they need to be checked. Whether it's full-blown zoning, health department, floodplain, and the inspection process, I mean, obviously, that's what we're here to discuss today. But, a run-in shed is much less degree of a hazard as a 40 by 50 pole building would be, where you might potentially have employees working in if you're farming and that type of thing.
So is there any sort of an expedited way we could look at some of those other things, or is it really just, so the hard part is, to me, you look at something and say, okay, well, this isn't an issue, but the only way you know it's not an issue is to actually be looking at it in the first place.
Correct. I mean, our typical turnaround time for residential plans, which that's what this would fall under, is in
We're 3 to 5 days,
5 days.
1 to almost 7 days.
That's not.
for processing. the permit.
Processing and getting it out the door.
Process,
Yeah.
what about from the time they start the inspections, you're waiting.
But we do
Well,
next day inspections, so
same-
if they dig their footers today, we can go out tomorrow to look at it.
So the last run-in shed that one of our citizens put up, it's less than 2,000 square feet. Tell the Board of Commissioners what size the rafters were, what the dimensions were of the rafters that you required.
Well, with this particular structure, I think it might have been 4 by 6 rafters or
4
something
by
like that.
16, not 6.
There-
Was it 4 by 12, maybe?
There's a couple caveats with that. Typically, when you're constructing any structure, the material you're using is graded, level 1, 2, or 3, depending on whether it has knots, it's clear lumber, those type things, the type of lumber and all that kind of stuff. With this particular structure, it was milled on site, so it was fresh green lumber.
Carroll County.
And I'm not sure what particular species was. It wasn't particularly dried through a process. So we worked with them to try to make a best guess estimate as to how this material related to what would be bought at Lowe's, Home Depot, and those type of things. So through our calculations, and I think we reached out to some other engineers too.
We did two other calculations by structural engineers on that one. yeah.
And through their guidance, we came up with what was required for this particular building.
It was ridiculous.
I'm saying here.
But you use size to offset the quality of the lumber, basically.
Correct.
Yeah,
Correct.
species and
So
size.
the very run-in shed that he
So you
could
had to
construct in Baltimore or Frederick, he can't construct in Carroll. He's held to a higher standard in Carroll.
Yeah, yeah,
We suggested this is
yeah.
minimum use of materials for these things. But here again, I guess you look at, landowner's responsibility compared to government's responsibility in this. And, I mean, it's for small structures, we just, the building's gonna be here, it is, they're reporting it. It's not it's on top of a septic system, it's not in a floodplain. We just let them put a small structure into that area without all the other regulation involved with it.
But 2,000 square feet is, you think that's a small structure, 40 by 50, or you're 20 by 100? I think that's.
Yeah, when the last code steering committee met and discussed this, that's when we went to the reduced fee with the F form. That 2,000 square foot building for the typical homeowner is going to cost roughly $290. Somebody with the F forms is going to pay $100 for that permit. They're going to get that permit 3 to 5 days and 2 inspections, a footer inspection and a fine.
Similar process.
It's a simpler process. It's very simple for a 2,000 square foot building.
Yeah, but it's not simple because the building code requirements they're putting on based on the unrated lumber, for example, and using worst case numbers result in a building being built with rafters 12-inch on center that are 4 by 12s in some cases. It turned into a building that looked like something you'd see in a cartoon joke.
Well, but the fact is, if they were using lumber that could substantiate to be a certain strength and a certain quality, that wouldn't have been the case, right?
That's correct.
That's correct.
However, if I saw out 5-quarter lumber and you're using milled standards on it, and you have a scale, I assume you can slide that on, but I guarantee it's probably, unless it has shakes or whatever, and it's probably a heavier material than what you're buying at Lowe's or Home Depot or wherever, so.
Yeah. The current program that we're using to check spans, we bought a new program about a year and a half ago. The building that Commissioner Rothschild was talking about, we ran those rough saw and run our own calculations. The 2 structural engineers came back a little more conservative than we did. So we actually allowed a little more tolerance to the homeowner than the structural engineers did. And we actually dropped back down to our last loading that we had from 40 down to 30. So unfortunately, that sawmill came, what he was using.
I don't want anything built.
Yeah.
Short, that's why I suggest maybe a suggestion page that goes with it, that just simply, we suggest this type of structure, this level of lumber be used in this, but here again, here that's the homeowner or the farmer's responsibility there. And I have no problem with, having a Schedule F, that they have to prove they are a legitimate farm that operates and pays taxes as such, otherwise they're not. And that solves your problem of coming, well, this is a farm structure. Well,
So how does someone that buys that farm later on know that that structure is any good? If it could be put up without building codes, how do they know it's any good? Now, maybe that person that put it up wants it to be at a certain, is comfortable taking that risk. How does the next homeowner take that risk or measure that risk?
My concern is that the builder comes in to the farmer for a 2,000 square foot building. Sometimes that owner has no idea how it's being built.
Right.
He's taking the assumption it's being built by some type of code.
Right. Right, and there's quite an array in the construction industry in terms of who will do what as well.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, to me, it comes down to, if there's a safe way to put up a building, it's like arguing whether or not we should stop at a red light at 3 o'clock in the morning on a quiet road. It either ought to be a blinking light, or it ought to not be, or we ought to follow the law. But I think we could all come up with an example of why some law doesn't make sense, because I'm sitting at a traffic light at 3 a.m. and there's no one around for miles on a quiet road. The problem is, as soon as one time someone goes through that light and gets killed, someone's going to say, why didn't you follow the law?
why didn't the other counties enforce building codes in '06 after all this?
I don't know, I can't answer that, but I can tell you other counties are wishing they had the same thing that we have because of the issues that that
Depends
previous.
who you talk to, what side.
That is true.
From our perspective, just the issues that they've
That
seen.
is true.
And I know Lionel too had reached out to insurance companies locally,
Yeah.
and they also told us that when they insure these structures, they're under the assumption that they're being built to a certain, to our standards.
They don't check though, do they?
They do not check, no.
Now, if we didn't have those standards, would they check?
I can't speak for them.
Well, no, but their rates may be different.
Well, right, but if they automatically know that we don't have any standards like that.
I mean, if you're an insurance company and you're insuring people in a jurisdiction that has no building standards, I'm sure your rates are higher than places that have fairly strict building standards, I would
Yes.
think.
Yeah, we get rated every 5 years as a county.
Yeah.
ISO comes in, Insurance Services Organization, they come in, they look at what codes we enforce, they look at our credentials for our inspectors,
Right.
and the county gets a rating, and then that rating can be used by insurance agencies to provide rates for citizens.
What is our rating right now?
Off the top of my head, I don't know, it's probably been maybe 4 years. Yeah.
There's a rating for everything today.
Well, give me a square footage of the work here for the small structures. It's kind of an agricultural
Well, you
structure.
did, you said 150, right?
Yeah, 150 is our current standard for prefab sheds. Typically, that's what we see on skids and things like that.
Yeah, no, I understand.
Long Miller Building. 1,500 square feet, but I just think for some of these small structures, it's.
Frederick County, 7,500.
I mean, I'd like to add, we're going to be reviewing the 2020 code, building code, to adopt, I mean, the 2018 code to adopt January 2020. We'll be going through the code steering committee process and before the board for the 2018 code coming up this coming year. So if this is something you want to bring before the code steering committee for review and recommendation. They'll look in and maybe come up to the run-in sheds. I think the majority of us do realize the run-in shed's a little different than something I'm putting machinery and people in.
You know, a large structure, now you're not gonna put up without inspections, I understand that, but some of these small ones, it's almost, agriculturally, it's almost ridiculous.
How long
It's a
does
three-sided
like that
structure,
last?
doesn't even, I'm sorry, what'd you say, Doug?
Whole building?
Yeah. So you put up a building lasts 20 years, and we're worried about 5 days and $100? I think people need to get over it. I really do. It's gonna stand up for 20 years, and we don't wanna make sure it's gonna stand there for 5 days and $100? I think, yeah, I mean,
It's not the permit costs, it's the additional building restrictions that are placed on these guys.
well, then that's a whole different issue.
I don't know if you can base that one incident on all of those, because typically when these people put these things up, I bet you most of them are gonna use fresh cut lumber.
Depending on the.
So I don't know why one instance like that would drive the rest of the decision.
Obviously.
I can tell you, and you all already know this, but I'll say it again, from a public safety standpoint, I'm against anything that's put up without a permit, period. Now, I would certainly be willing to either decrease the cost to make it easier or whatever. I mean, I don't know if $100 is a reasonable cost, I don't know, I mean.
Well, how much it cost to put up a 2,100 square foot or 2,500 square foot building? Even if you do it yourself, you gotta have, what, a couple $1,000 in it, don't you?
Yeah, right.
Yeah, I mean, this seems.
Yeah, I mean, a 40 by 50 pole buildings, and I'm just throwing out a wild guess, but it's gonna be over $20,000, $30,000.
25,
That's a pretty,
Talk about $100, and we probably have $300 worth of labor just in doing permits and checking things and calling insurance companies and all this other stuff that we do to do a good job. I'm not criticizing that, I'm just saying, people are getting a pretty good bargain, I think.
Jason, did I hear you suggest that although you generally oppose this, you would be
Yeah,
willing
from
to support an
300
exception for
residents.
run-in sheds?
I think the run-in sheds are a little bit different animal when you're talking about a smaller type, no pun intended. You're talking about a smaller type structure, you're not gonna have people in there, it's livestock, it's out in the middle of the field. Typically, they are lower type structures and things like that. I think that's something we would be open to considering. Size-wise can always get tricky, because again, if you talk a larger type structure, there could be large run-in sheds. So, I think we would want to try to maintain some consistency. And some of the consistency we'd like to also look at is when we get the argument of the residential person who wants to put in that same three-sided shed but may want to store his tractor and stuff in versus the farmer who wants to put his cattle in that same shed, should that same exemption apply? And that's where we also struggle sometimes in previous years where people would come in and make that argument. And that's why this was cleaned up as well.
To prove that they're agricultural. If they don't have that, argument's out.
So, yeah, I think this is limited to agricultural. How large, going back to the run-in sheds, so what would the size limit be that you think would be practical and something that you could live with?
I think you're backing him into a corner. I don't think you should even answer that question. He said he thinks it ought to be what it is now. We're trying to put words in his mouth.
No, he said
I mean, the fact is, if a building falls on your head, who the hell cares what you were intended to use the building for? The laws of physics don't change because of the use of the building.
It's a three-sided structure. Jason, you indicated you think they could possibly, exception could be carved out. How large do you think would be reasonable for a typical run-in shed, if we were to make an exception for that?
Let me ask you an example. If I go to buy one of these commercial made buildings on skids and they pull it in, and it's 1,000 square feet, they pull it in, drop it off, is there a permit needed for that?
Yes. Yeah, the 150 square foot is the cutoff. So if it's a prefab shed.
Even agricultural?
Yeah, if it's on skids and it's a prefab shed and movable, 150 square foot is the
But we're
cutoff.
looking at one probably put in the poles and it's more.
Yeah, so
It's not gonna be, or it could be.
correct. If it's permanent, then that's when the permit's triggered because, again, if it's permanent, we don't want it to not meet the proper setbacks. We don't want it to be constructed in the floodplain. We don't want it to be constructed at or near the well or septic system because once it's there, it's very hard to tell somebody to tear it down. If it's on skids and it's 140 square foot, we can easily, if need be, go out and tell them you need to drag it out, 10 feet away from the property or adjust where it's located at. So the prefab versus the permanent is a distinction there.
Well, even Frederick requires a zoning permit to ensure that the placement's correct. And if they pull a zoning permit here and then put the run-in shed or whatever on the wrong spot, a different spot than what they say, then we'd have grounds to make them tear it down. So I don't think that's an issue, because we're not proposing to eliminate the requirement to pull a zoning permit. We're only suggesting, Commissioner Weaver and I are suggesting that we remove the need for them to build a building permit for certain types of structures like a run-in shed that would be relatively small. And I think I heard you say, given that there are only three-sided structures, you would consider that. I think that's what you said.
Well, provided it's consistent with our 150 square foot that's already outlined in the code.
Well, run-in sheds are bigger than 150 feet typically.
That's why he's not saying what you're saying. That's what I'm saying.
Jeff, go ahead.
Right. And just to add, just two quick things is one, as Jason stated, is, these other surrounding counties that they put something in place in the past and they kind of wish they had our same policies and processes in place. So we do have to respect our staff's point on this. The other thing we could possibly look at, and Jason and Lionel, comment on, is maybe we can look at this as a regional committee to look at this, look at this locally, but look at it regionally to say, what does this, what are the recommendations of the committees before we go ahead and, look at this and look at all the, look at these different options and points that have been brought up here today.
Yeah, I would like to be looked at. I mean, you guys just say you're going to review our code, but also look at what other counties are doing but pay particular attention to what problems they're having because they're doing it that way. How many of their sheds or running buildings or whatever they are fall down and how often, you know what I mean? Because it's important to know that as well. But I certainly would like to, in the words of Annapolis, let's send this out to a summer study. Let's look at this to get a little bit more information on it, because I can see Commissioner Weaver's point, I really can, but I also see, like Commissioner Lance here, safety, it's got to be safe. And I don't want people getting hurt because we allow this to happen.
Let me make a motion that we send this to the Code Enforcement Committee to review, to look at size, look at all the issues we brought up here today, and we come back to the commissioners in this.
With their recommendation.
Are you talking about in the context of the regular study that's being done, or doing it separately? Because you said that's when.
It's going to be starting towards the end of this year, first part of
So is your motion just to include it in that
To
process?
include it in that
Move it to the
process, to
process.
be reviewed as an agricultural exemption
Before,
on building.
before anybody seconds that, Commissioner Whedon, you also, I assume, mean, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but also in the context of looking at what other counties are doing too, so that we remain somewhat
part of the
congruent
process.
think
with
that's
other
part of the
counties, because
process.
right now, I think we're out of
County's doing
line.
something stupid, what do we care?
Well, you followed them down the ethics ordinance route, they did stupid things, you followed them
Well,
there, Doug.
I did.
That's why, I mean, if we're going to look at other counties, I also want to look at the problems that they're having because of this particular thing. And if we're just looking at, they do this and they allow, okay, but because of their allowing that, or is there problems because of this? Or like they're having problems, you know, what I already mentioned, buildings falling down and get blown over, or whatever it is.
We send it to the code committee, or to the.
Yeah, and you guys,
And how
Get
many
back.
people do we think this is affecting right now? Because I'm a little concerned that if any two people happen to capture the right person in the hallway, we're willing to change the law. I mean, are we talking about 50 people, 100 people, 1,000 people, or 7? That have had a problem where they couldn't get their process through?
Well, I hate to say it, what most of the times, they just go ahead and put it up and don't even bother with us. Because we, have to go through it, but that's what normally happens.
Could I make a comment? So,
no, this is not public comment,
No.
sorry.
Weaver and I asked him to come, because he builds these things, we thought it would be valuable to have his
Well, they're
30
gonna
minutes
look
of
at it,
input.
so.
That's all I do, throw it out to the committee to look at and come back with a recommendation. That's what I'm asking for. So I made a motion
Right.
on that.
To put it out there, have them look at it, come back, second. Any further discussion? All those in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
No.
No.
3-2.
Well, we don't even know if there's a need. I think we're talking about 3 people. I think 3 people found you, 2 people found him, and we're willing to change 8 laws. I don't think that's the way I would set public policy.
All right. Thank you. Do we have anything else?
Well, I just want to
The
say,
answer is no. Go ahead. No, sorry, go ahead.
it's fine. Just before we adjourn, I just want to know that based on the conversation earlier about the site distance and the lack of interest of commissioners to change anything, we have been holding up a couple site distance enforcement tasks issues, and staff is now going to go ahead and
Yeah, they have to
follow
move
through the
forward.
normal
Yes.
process
Yep.
with enforcing those.
Now, well, our citizens will be pleased to know they have no remedies under the BZA, since we've chosen not to give the BZA any authorities to issue variances.
We will, oh, yeah. Since this is the end of the meeting, if you want to make public comment now, you're allowed to.
well, I just,
Come up to the
Microphone.
mic.
Introduce yourself.
I'm a farmer, and I just wanted to say that there is a need for it. It's a burden on farmers to have to do this. These are simple structures, very simple structures. The safety issue, I think, is kind of moot because they are such simple structures. A lot of you guys are in the farming, the rural areas, and I'm sure many of the farmers in those areas would be very interested to have this as not a burden on farmers. Yeah, I mean, it's a lot of the other counties, not a lot, but Baltimore is probably the most liberal on it. Frederick seems to have maybe the way you guys are going with at least getting the lines figured out. And I talked to Frederick this morning, and they said that it's just a matter of figuring out where it goes, and then they don't even do a construction inspection. So, but yeah, I mean, it is a burden. It probably costs you guys more to have to mess with these structures than what you're charging for the permit. I mean, it's just unnecessary.
I spoke with the Frederick County Councilman who confirmed
Thank
what you
you.
said.
All right, we need a motion to adjourn. Do we have a second?
Yep.
All those in favor? Aye.